Welcome to the presentation, Passive and Active Sentence Structures. As we go through this lesson, I'm going to use a pocket style manual. You can find some information about this and how to write anything as well, but sometimes it's confusing when we're using two different books, and I think not a whole lot gets added either way. So if you want to look it up in the index and find it in your Ruskowitz book and just kind of do your best with that, if you don't have a pocket style manual or you just really love having two books open because it makes you look really studious, then go for it. But in this case, I'm going to use a pocket style manual, and hopefully that helps. Now as we open up our hacker books and start looking in there and those page numbers, I want us to think about the usual sort of classic sentence structure that most of us are used to building around when we build our own sentences. And that is a subject plus an action verb, and that's, again, who is doing what. And when you start looking at examples on that in our hacker book, their example of passive or of active there is the committee reached a decision. So, okay, who is doing what? Well, the subject is committee, verb is reached, and there you have it. Object is decision. Now, we'll get into what passive means here shortly, but keep in mind that when we're dealing with classic structure, some of us like to write the way we speak, which is using a lot of there is, there are, it is, and I use a lot of that in my own speech. When we write that way, it starts slowing us down, and when we begin sentences that way, it sort of makes readers have to wait for the really good information. So that's a part of this topic that we'll be getting into as well. Let's quickly then discuss what active and passive voice even means. And I've got it here on the screen. You can also look in your hacker manual, pocket style manual, to see how they define it. And I'm going to read what they write first. In the active voice, the subject of the sentence performs the action. In the passive, the subject receives the action. So looking at our example again, the subject performs the action. The committee reached. The subject, committee, is performing the action of reaching, the decision in this case. The passive verb, however, it's receiving the action. And another way of thinking about that is, we can see on the screen, I've put some other ways of thinking about that. It's something is being done to the subject of the sentence, and we're seeing here in our book, a decision was reached by the committee. It is receiving the action. Now, this is a little confusing because still the committee is the one who's making that decision, right? But it's all in the way that we structure the sentence. We'll talk about why we might even want to do it that way shortly. But when we see that they are receiving the action, in other words, the decision was reached, and we don't even get to this actual subject who is doing the action until the end of the sentence, that's what makes it a passive voice. Is a sentence subject is usually toward the end, the action has already happened, and the committee, in this case, the subject is receiving the action. If this is still not completely clear, just hang on. We'll look at a couple of examples yet and see how this works. Now, the other thing to keep in mind with this is often the order of the sentence doesn't make a difference. So when you go to do exercises on this and look at it in your own writing, keep in mind that generally in a passive voice, what you have to ask for is, okay, is the subject of the sentence that would be doing the action, is that after the verb? So again, in our example, normally committee would be before the action in sort of a classic active form. Committee reached, but committee is after reached, so its subject is after the verb, and that tells us that what would normally be doing the action is after the verb, therefore it's probably passive voice. And the reason that we might want to change it then is because that can be a little confusing for other people when they're reading it, especially people who are maybe not used to English and might not be used to the structure. And also it can be slower, a little bit more confusing for readers, but also just plods along a little bit more the way it's structured. So that's why we're looking at this. I added an example partly to just show a picture of one of our dogs, but partly to show an example of how you can improve a sentence in two different ways. And for those of you who are worried that taking words out will make you lose momentum toward your page minimum or word minimum, you can see that we can take the there is away and then add some details. And I always like to encourage writers to add more details. Often we can improve them more than one way at once as we revise. We can take the there is out, but then we can add more detail. And so we've not only made it clearer and more interesting, but we've also added a little bit more meaning to it as well. Now, let's talk briefly about when you might want to use passive voice. And something to keep in mind here is that some disciplines, some fields of study may use passive a lot more than other fields of study. For example, in scientific research, a lot of times the emphasis is on the research itself and not so much the researcher. And so when I've done even some editing for people who are doing scientific research, and I've helped them with their grammar and formatting. They're doing mostly APA formatting. And I've noticed there is a lot more passive voice being used. Well, it's because the emphasis is on the research and the information than on who did it. So that might be when you want to use it. Here's something that's more relevant to our particular class interests. Again, when you're focusing on the object of the sentence. So in this case, the Marshall County Humane Society was founded to serve the people and animals of Marshall County, Indiana. Now in this case, our emphasis is on the Marshall County Humane Society. We don't really need to talk about who founded it. We don't really need to know much about them for the sake of writing about it in our paper. Maybe that would be interesting information to have later, maybe it would, but we're not really interested in writing that in our paper right now. We're just trying to tell about when it started. So we would say the Marshall County Humane Society was founded to serve, and then tell, why it's around and all of that. Now, if you look in that sentence, you'll say, well, who is doing the founding? Who is the subject? Who is doing the founding? And that's a good question. It doesn't really say. And that is all right. That is okay. In that case, we're basically saying we're not sure, or we don't know, or it's not really important to what we're saying. And that's another example of using the passive voice. And in this case, it's a little bit more advanced than what we've talked about so far. But again, it's another technique. Another way of looking at it is donations may be dropped off at, maybe it's the Humane Society, maybe it's somewhere else, between the hours of such and such. So again, here, who is dropping off the donations? Well, we don't know. We're hoping lots of people do, but we don't know anybody specific. So again, they're keeping the subject out of there. They're putting the first word in there, and that's really the object. That's what is being dropped off. But we're using the structure because we don't know, or it doesn't matter. So again, this is something worth knowing for your future writing. Well, sometimes we use passive sentence structures to highlight a particular part of the sentence, or maybe a particular organization or a particular action, and the doer is not necessarily the most important thing. We don't even include that. Another reason we might use passive sentence structure is to take the doer out of the picture completely. And we see this sometimes with political figures especially. They like to be sort of greasy and not include very important things that we might need to see in order to know who actually did something. The passive sentence structure gets used to get the message out there, but without the doer actually included. So, for example, the cookies were all eaten. Well, who ate the cookies? We have no idea. That's not even in the sentence. It's hidden. We often hear in press conferences for political or other big organizations, someone will get up and say mistakes were made. They don't take responsibility. They don't see who made the mistakes. They don't want you to think about that. They want you to think that you're lucky that they're just saying the word mistake in the first place. So they'll say mistakes were made. We don't see the doer in either of these two examples, and that's on purpose. In review, then, we want to avoid passive sentence structure in most of our academic writing. It is done often in the sciences. So for those of you who are going more into the sciences and are going to write quite a bit about research as opposed to your own actions, that will end up being something that you use down the road, and it's important to know how that works. But most of the academic writing we're doing right now, we do want to use active sentence structure. So we're going to work on those as opposed to passive sentence structures. At the same time, we do want to be aware of when we might use passive sentence structures, either to focus on a specific object that's being acted upon, or to remove the doer from the sentence altogether, either to keep the doer in the background or to sort of mask who did what action. As we said in our example, someone could say, the cookies were all eaten, without saying, I ate the cookies, or, as you can see on your screen, this guilty looking dog ate all the cookies.